What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a friendly conversation and instead gets blindsided by a host who seems determined to tear him down? In just 33 seconds of questioning, Tamron Hall managed to ignite a firestorm that would end with Samuel L. Jackson walking off her set in front of a stunned studio audience. Samuel L. Jackson arrived at the studio that day the same way he always does, with professionalism and respect. He's done hundreds of interviews over his decades-long career. He knows the game. He sits down, exchanges pleasantries, and talks about his work. Simple. But from the moment he settled into that guest chair across from Tamron Hall, something felt different. The energy in the room was off. The usual warmth that guests expect from daytime television was nowhere to be found. Tamron started the interview normally enough. She welcomed Samuel to the show, and the audience applauded. He smiled and thanked her for having him. Then she began talking about his latest film project, asking him about the character he played and what drew him to the role. Samuel answered thoughtfully, explaining his process and what he loved about the script. The audience seemed engaged, and everything appeared to be going smoothly. But then Tamron shifted gears. She leaned forward in her chair with a look that Samuel would later describe as almost predatory. "You know, Samuel," she said, her voice taking on a sharp edge, "a lot of people have been saying that you've been coasting on the same tough guy persona for years now. Do you ever worry that audiences are getting tired of seeing you play the same character over and over again?" The audience went quiet. Samuel's smile faltered for just a moment before he composed himself. "Well, Tamron," he replied calmly, "I think if you actually watch my films, you'd see that each character is very different. I've played everything from a Jedi Master to a hitman to a coach to a superhero. The range is there if people care to look." Tamron waved her hand dismissively. "Sure, but they all have that same Samuel L. Jackson energy, don't they? That intensity, that anger. Some critics have said you're basically playing yourself at this point." Samuel's jaw tightened. He took a breath before responding. "I bring authenticity to my roles. That's what audiences connect with. That's what directors hire me for. If that reads as anger to you, maybe you're missing the nuance in the performances." The tension in the studio was already building, but Tamron wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying herself. She flipped through her note cards with an exaggerated casualness that felt deliberate. "Let's talk about your early career," she said. "You struggled with addiction for years before you got sober. And even after that, it took you a long time to get your big break. Do you think maybe you got lucky, that you were in the right place at the right time?" Samuel stared at her. The disrespect was palpable now. Here was a woman sitting in her comfortable host chair, questioning the legitimacy of decades of hard work. "Lucky?" he repeated slowly. "I worked my tail off for 30 years before I got recognized. I did theater, I did small roles, I fought through personal demons, and I never gave up. Luck had nothing to do with it. But you have to admit," Tamron pressed on, "there are plenty of talented actors who never make it. What makes you so special? Talent, dedication, and perseverance?" Samuel shot back. "Three things that clearly don't matter much in this interview." A few people in the audience gasped. Tamron's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to guests pushing back, and she definitely wasn't used to being called out on her own show. "That's a bit defensive, don't you think?" she said with a condescending smile. "I'm just asking questions here. This is what interviews are." "No," Samuel said firmly, his voice rising slightly. "Interviews are conversations. This feels more like an ambush. You invited me here to promote my film, not to justify my entire existence to you." Tamron laughed, but it was a cold sound. "Oh, come on, Samuel. You're a big, tough movie star. Surely you can handle a few hard questions." "Hard questions are fine," Samuel replied. "Disrespectful ones aren't. There's a difference between challenging someone and belittling them, and you crossed that line about 5 minutes ago." The audience was completely silent now. People were looking at each other uncomfortably. This wasn't the light, fun, daytime television they'd signed up for. This was getting ugly, but Tamron wasn't done. If anything, Samuel's pushback only seemed to embolden her. She leaned back in her chair with an air of superiority. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think you've gotten so used to people kissing up to you that you can't handle it when someone actually questions you. You're used to being treated like royalty because you're Samuel L. Jackson. But in this chair, you're just another guest." Samuel stood up. The movement was so sudden that it startled everyone in the studio. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood, looked Tamron directly in the eyes, and said, "And in that chair, you're just another person who forgot how to treat people with basic respect." Tamron's mouth fell open. "Excuse me?" she sputtered. "You can't just walk out in the middle of my show." "Watch me," Samuel said simply. He started to remove his microphone. Tamron jumped up from her own chair, suddenly realizing that this was actually happening. "Samuel, sit down," she demanded. "We're not finished here." "Yes, we are," he replied calmly, handing his mic to a stunned production assistant. "I've been doing this job long enough to know when I'm being disrespected, and I don't have to sit here and take it. Not from you, not from anyone." Tamron's face flushed red. "This is incredibly unprofessional," she snapped. "I have a show to run. I have an audience. You agreed to be here." Samuel turned to face her one more time. "I agreed to do an interview, not to be insulted. There's a difference. And if this is how you treat your guests, I feel sorry for anyone else who has to sit in that chair." The audience was frozen. No one knew whether to applaud or stay silent. A few crew members had started moving toward the stage, unsure if they should intervene. Tamron, desperate to regain control, tried one more time. "You're really going to throw a tantrum and walk out because I asked you some tough questions? That's very mature, Samuel." "Tough questions?" Samuel repeated incredulously. "You called my entire career luck. You suggested I'm a one-note actor. You've been condescending from the moment this interview started. Those aren't tough questions. That's just you being rude because you think your platform gives you the right to talk down to people." "I was doing my job," Tamron protested weakly. "No," Samuel corrected her. "Your job is to have interesting conversations with your guests. Your job is to make people feel welcome on your show. Your job is to ask questions that enlighten your audience, not to stroke your own ego by trying to take down someone more successful than you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tamron's expression shifted from anger to something closer to shock. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Samuel shook his head slowly. "I've done thousands of interviews," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. "I've been asked hard questions by some of the toughest journalists in the business. I've never walked out of an interview in my life. But I've also never been treated with such blatant disrespect by someone who's supposed to be a professional." He started walking toward the exit. Tamron finally found her voice. "Samuel, please," she called out, and for the first time there was a hint of desperation in her tone. "Let's just take a breath and start over." Samuel paused but didn't turn around. "You can't start over from this," he said. "You showed me exactly who you are in the first 10 minutes of this interview. I don't need to see any more." "But the audience," Tamron tried, gesturing to the crowd. "They came here to see you." Now Samuel did turn around, and when he spoke, his voice was directed at the audience, not at Tamron. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this," he said sincerely. "You deserve better than to watch someone use their platform to try and tear someone else down. I hope the rest of your day is more pleasant than this was." A few people in the audience actually started clapping. It was scattered at first, just a handful of people, but then more joined in. Within seconds, a significant portion of the studio audience was applauding Samuel L. Jackson as he walked off the set. Tamron stood there, her face a mixture of anger and humiliation, as her own audience applauded her guest's departure. "Well," she said, trying desperately to regain some composure, "that was certainly unexpected." But her voice was shaking. The confident, superior tone from earlier was completely gone. She looked to her producers in the wings, clearly hoping for some guidance on how to salvage this disaster. Samuel was almost to the exit when Tamron made one final attempt. "You know what, Samuel?" she called out loudly. "Maybe you're not as tough as you pretend to be in your movies. Maybe you're actually just fragile." Samuel stopped walking. The entire studio held its breath. For a long moment, he just stood there with his back to her. Then, slowly, he turned around one last time. "There's nothing fragile about knowing your worth," he said quietly but firmly. "There's nothing fragile about refusing to let someone disrespect you on national television. What's fragile is a host who thinks the only way to seem important is to make their guests feel small." He looked around the studio one more time. "I've worked with some of the greatest directors in Hollywood. I've shared scenes with incredible actors. I've been part of films that changed cinema. And in all that time, through all those experiences, I've learned one thing above everything else. How you treat people matters. It matters more than ratings, more than viral moments, more than anything else. And how you treated me today was unacceptable." With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked out of the studio. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded deafening in the absolute silence that followed. Tamron stood alone on her stage, her face pale. The audience wasn't clapping anymore. They were just staring at her. Some looked shocked, some looked disappointed, a few looked angry on Samuel's behalf. "Well," Tamron said again, her voice barely above a whisper now, "let's go to commercial." The lights dimmed and the audience sat in stunned silence. Crew members rushed around, trying to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how daytime television was supposed to go. This wasn't the light, breezy content that people tuned in for during their lunch breaks. When the commercial break ended, Tamron tried to continue the show. She brought out her next guest and attempted to act like nothing had happened, but everyone could see it in her eyes. The confidence was gone. The superiority complex had been shattered. Samuel L. Jackson had walked onto her show as a guest and walked out as the clear victor in an exchange that never should have happened in the first place. What made the whole situation even more striking was Samuel's composure throughout. He never yelled. He never cursed, even though everyone knows he certainly could have. He never got physical or aggressive. He simply stood up for himself with dignity and walked away from a situation that had become untenable. In doing so, he demonstrated more grace under pressure than his host had shown in the entire interview. The incident raised serious questions about what had gotten into Tamron Hall that day. This was someone who had built a career on being personable and relatable. She'd interviewed countless celebrities and public figures, usually with warmth and genuine curiosity. So what changed? Why did she decide to take such an aggressive, condescending approach with Samuel L. Jackson of all people? Some speculated that she was trying to make a name for herself by going viral with a tough interview. Others suggested that maybe she'd gotten too comfortable in her position and had started to believe her own hype. Whatever the reason, the strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of looking like a hard-hitting journalist, she came across as someone who had confused cruelty with courage. What's particularly notable is how Samuel handled the situation from a communication standpoint. He didn't just get angry and storm off. He articulated exactly why her behavior was unacceptable. He drew clear boundaries. He explained the difference between challenging questions and disrespectful ones. He gave her multiple opportunities to course correct, and only when it became clear that she had no intention of doing so did he remove himself from the situation. This is a masterclass in self-respect. In an industry where actors are often expected to smile through uncomfortable situations for the sake of promotion, Samuel L. Jackson made it clear that there are limits. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, and when someone crosses them, you have every right to walk away, regardless of how it might look. The audience's reaction was telling as well. They didn't boo Samuel for leaving. They applauded him. They recognized that he was the wrong party in this exchange. They saw through Tamron's attempts to paint herself as the victim of an unprofessional guest. The truth was obvious to everyone in that studio. This was a host who had forgotten the basic rules of hospitality and human decency. From the moment Tamron made that first snide comment about Samuel coasting on the same persona, the interview was doomed. She set a tone of antagonism rather than conversation. She approached the interview as if Samuel L. Jackson owed her something, as if his presence on her show was an opportunity for her to prove her journalistic chops by taking him down a peg. But Samuel L. Jackson doesn't owe anyone anything. He's earned his place in Hollywood through talent, hard work, and perseverance, just as he said. He's proven himself over and over again across dozens of films and multiple decades. He didn't need to justify himself to Tamron Hall or anyone else. When she questioned whether he'd just gotten lucky, it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how success works in entertainment. Luck might open a door, but it doesn't sustain a career. You don't become one of the highest-grossing actors of all time through luck. You don't become a cultural icon through luck. You don't earn the respect of your peers and audiences worldwide through luck. You do it through consistent excellence. And that's exactly what Samuel has delivered throughout his career. Tamron's suggestion that he was playing the same character over and over showed either ignorance of his work or a willful desire to diminish his achievements. Anyone who's actually watched his films knows the range he possesses. The fury in Jules Winfield is nothing like the wisdom of Mace Windu. The vulnerability he showed in films like The Sunset Limited is worlds apart from the action hero roles. The mentorship in Coach Carter is completely different from the intensity in The Hateful Eight. The man has range, and lots of it. But beyond the specific criticisms, what really made the interview untenable was Tamron's attitude. The condescension dripped from every word. The way she waved off his responses. The way she smiled, that cold smile when he pushed back. The way she accused him of being defensive when he was simply defending his work and his legacy. It all added up to a host who had let whatever personal issues or professional ambitions she had cloud her judgment completely. When Samuel called her out for being disrespectful, she should have apologized. She should have acknowledged that maybe she'd taken things too far. She should have tried to reset the conversation and move forward in a more productive direction. Instead, she doubled down. She got defensive. She tried to paint his very reasonable reaction as an overreaction. She tried to make it seem like he was the problem for not tolerating her behavior. This is a common tactic that people use when they're called out for bad behavior. Rather than accept responsibility, they try to make the other person seem overly sensitive or unable to handle criticism, but Samuel saw right through it. He recognized it for what it was and refused to play along. His comment about Tamron forgetting how to treat people with basic respect cut right to the heart of the issue. This wasn't about tough journalism or hard-hitting questions. This was about basic human decency. This was about treating a guest on your show with the same courtesy you'd want to be treated with if you were in their position. Tamron failed that simple test, and Samuel called her on it. When she tried to invoke professionalism, claiming he was being unprofessional by leaving, Samuel turned that argument on its head. What's unprofessional is inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of a promotional interview and then using that platform to attack them. What's unprofessional is using your position of power as the host to try and make your guest look bad. What's unprofessional is caring more about creating a moment than about having a genuine conversation. Samuel's parting shots were particularly effective because they were true. He acknowledged his extensive experience with interviews, making it clear that this wasn't just him being temperamental. He'd sat through countless interviews, including difficult ones, without incident. This was different. This crossed a line. And by framing it that way, he made it impossible for Tamron or anyone else to dismiss his reaction as typical diva behavior. The comment about never walking out of an interview before carried significant weight. Here's someone with a career spanning decades, someone who's done press junkets and talk shows and magazine interviews and everything in between, saying that this particular situation was so egregious that it warranted a first-time response. That says everything about how far over the line Tamron had gone. When Tamron tried to use the audience as leverage, suggesting that Samuel owed it to them to stay, he flipped that script beautifully. He apologized to the audience for what they had to witness, but he made it clear that the fault lay with Tamron, not with him. He positioned himself as someone who respected the audience enough not to put them through more of this uncomfortable spectacle. Meanwhile, Tamron was the one who had created this situation in the first place. The audience's applause for Samuel's departure was the ultimate validation of his decision. These were people who had come to see a fun talk show interview. They had no agenda. They had no reason to take sides based on anything other than what they witnessed in that studio. And what they witnessed was a respected actor being disrespected by a host who should have known better. So they applauded him for standing up for himself. And in doing so, they sent Tamron a clear message about whose side they were on. Tamron's final jab, calling Samuel fragile, was perhaps the most revealing moment of all. It showed that even after everything, even after Samuel had articulated exactly why her behavior was wrong, she still didn't get it. She still thought the problem was his sensitivity rather than her disrespect. She still wanted to have the last word, to land one more blow, to salvage something from this disaster by making him look weak. But Samuel's response demolished that attempt completely. He reframed strength and fragility in a way that exposed the hollowness of her attack. Knowing your worth isn't fragile. Standing up for yourself isn't fragile. Refusing to accept mistreatment isn't fragile. What's fragile is needing to tear others down to feel important. What's fragile is doubling and tripling down on bad behavior rather than admitting you were wrong. What's fragile is caring more about your ego than about doing the right thing. His final statement about how you treat people mattering more than anything else was the perfect ending to this whole debacle. It crystallized the core issue. It reminded everyone watching what actually matters in life. Ratings come and go. Viral moments fade. But how you treat people, that's what defines you. That's what people remember. And on this day, Tamron Hall showed that she was willing to sacrifice basic decency for what she thought would be a memorable television moment. Well, she got her memorable moment, just not in the way she intended. Instead of being remembered as the host who asked tough questions and held a celebrity accountable, she'll be remembered as the host who was so disrespectful that Samuel L. Jackson walked off her show. Instead of elevating her reputation, she damaged it. Instead of making herself look strong and fearless, she made herself look petty and cruel. The contrast between how Samuel conducted himself and how Tamron conducted herself couldn't be more stark. Samuel was calm, articulate, and dignified even as he was being attacked. Tamron was aggressive, dismissive, and unable to recognize when she'd gone too far. Samuel spoke in complete thoughts and backed up his positions with clear reasoning. Tamron relied on condescension and cheap shots. Samuel showed respect for the audience even as he was leaving. Tamron seemed to forget they existed until she needed them as a reason for Samuel to stay. This is what happens when someone in a position of power forgets that power comes with responsibility. As a talk show host, Tamron has the power to shape narratives, to make guests look good or bad, to control the flow of conversation. But with that power comes the responsibility to use it ethically, to be fair, to be respectful, to remember that the people sitting in that guest chair are human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of how famous they are or how badly you want a viral moment. Tamron forgot all of that, or maybe she never understood it in the first place. Either way, Samuel L. Jackson gave her a lesson she won't soon forget. He showed her, and everyone watching, that there are consequences for treating people poorly. He showed that you don't have to sit there and take abuse just because someone has a camera pointed at you. He showed that walking away from a bad situation isn't weakness. It's strength. The whole incident serves as a reminder of something important. Respect is not negotiable. It doesn't matter how famous you are, how important your show is, or how much you want a particular soundbite. If you can't treat people with basic respect, you don't deserve their time or their participation. Samuel L. Jackson understood this. Tamron Hall clearly did not. So there you have it, the story of how one of Hollywood's biggest stars walked off a daytime talk show because the host forgot how to be a decent human being. The story of how an interview that should have been a simple promotional conversation turned into a masterclass in standing up for yourself. The story of how Tamron Hall learned, in the most public way possible, that treating your guests with respect isn't optional, it's essential.